race hate crimes rose to a record high last year, as the Home Office said the Black Lives Matter and the counter-protests partly fueled the surge. The number of crimes recorded as race hate offences jumped by nearly 12% from over 75,000 to 85,000, the biggest increase since records began back in 2016. The Home Office report said police had improved the way the crimes were recorded, but said there had also been a short-term genuine rise in hate crimes following trigger events such as Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the counter-protests by far-right groups. Leroy Logan is a former superintendent in the Met Police, former chair of the Black Police Officers Association as well. Leroy, welcome to you. Good to have you with us again. What are you making of this as an obvious sort of, if you like, shorthand answer that if something is very much in the news, people are more vigilant, they're more likely to report, they see something on social media, they're likely to try and register that with somebody that an offence or a crime has been committed. So nothing to panic about here.
Well, I think it's a worrying trend that hate crime is building. I mean, we saw it in the Brexit 2016 elections, and there seemed to be a hardening around immigration and people of difference. And so there was a significant increase of hate crime in 2016. And I just think that hardening has continued even now. And of course, the Black Lives Matter, in some people's eyes, was a step too far, and they've shown their resentment and their concerns. And a lot of it is fueled on ignorance, really. They don't really understand what is going on. And, if you fuel people's ignorance, you get anger and various forms of violence.
Yeah. I guess one of the areas, Leroy, that interests me is how do we define a hate crime? I know that when I've spoken to people who do surveys on this kind of stuff, not to try and dilute anything here, but the brief is quite wide. So if somebody had written something in support of Black Lives Matter and I'd replied to that tweet saying, I happen to think this is a crackpot organisation that does nothing other than galvanise, mostly left-wing fools into believing X, Y, and Z. If I wrote that reply, which, by the way, I haven't, somebody could be offended by that, and when asked, have you been on the receiving end of a hate crime, they might say yes, because they thought what I'd said was hateful.
Yeah, it's got a very wide scope, and it's like a catch-all situation, because some of this hate crime can be very subtle and very insidious. And then obviously social media has widened the scope even more, because as you say, it could be in just response to a tweet or any other form of messaging on social platforms. So yeah, it is something that is down to an individual's perception of what has happened to them. And with some people, it's not an issue. But some people who are very sensitive to these concerns, they will report it. And obviously you can report these things online, so you don't actually have to go into a police station to report it. So the accessibility of the information and communicating your concerns is much more streamlined.
It is difficult, isn't it? A friend of mine who's disabled, he's blind, and he had a phone call from an organisation that was trying to look at disability hate crimes and was asked if he'd been on the receiving end of anything, and he said no. And the person on the other end said, well, come on, there must be something. And he was like, well, no. And they were very disappointed that he wasn't able to even, I think the example they gave, well, did somebody barge into you on a train? Well, I mean, if that is the bar, or where we're setting the bar, then we're not, based on that, it's anecdotal, I get it, but we're not necessarily getting an authentic picture of what's really going on out there. In fact, it could be rather dangerous, Leroy, in that it might be obliterating the more serious areas by trying to focus on what people call microaggressions or things that happen to anyone in any group.
Yeah, I agree with you. There can be a tendency to lower the bar, but it has to be sensitive to the subtleties of hate crime. It's not necessarily someone just comes up to you and uses the N word or the W word, or assaults you in any way. So there needs to be that sensitivity, but at the same time there needs to be a real common sense approach. And I think it's because the Met and other constabularies have been found wanting when it comes to hate crime. They haven't really investigated them as well as they should, including the sexual offences and the various misogyny-based type allegations. So, I think it's really them trying to find their way through the laws and procedures. But I would like to think that, we can improve on this as time goes on.
Leroy, thank you. Leroy Logan, former superintendent in the Met and former chair of the Black Police Officers Association as well. What are you making of that? I've never seen any organisation, whether they're talking about hate crime around disability, anti-Semitism, racism in other areas. I mentioned disability there. Gender-based sexism, anything. I've never seen one of those organisations send out a press release saying it's got better. I'm not suggesting that that's suspicious in itself, but I do think that if you allow anonymous online reporting of something, then your margin of error has to also be acknowledged as well. And do you play to sensitivities? If somebody says, well, I feel